Okay, so let's begin with the first point of contention in the many, many briefs that have been filed to the court in this case. And Professor Yu, let me start with you. There's the simple disagreement over whether or not a president, a former president, qualifies as an officer of the United States in terms of what the Section 3 reads. Your argument is?
Sometimes it helps when interpreting the Constitution to actually look at the text closely first before we get into all the history and precedent and practice. And here I think the text is fairly clear. It has two parts. One, the beginning, the first sentence you wrote is, what offices are you not allowed to hold? And then the second part is, what office did you have in the past that disqualifies you for having this new post? So the first sentence, just a list of things you're not allowed to do if you had engaged in insurrection and then had taken oath before, include, and I think it's pretty precise, senator, representative in Congress, so a member of the legislature, elector for president and vice president, and then the phrase you just mentioned, Magna, any office, civil or military, under the United States. Now, the Constitution pretty clearly distinguishes between president on one hand and an officer of the United States. An officer of the United States is be like a cabinet officer or anyone below cabinet. He or she might be be a prosecutor, a line prosecutor in the Justice Department at a U.S. Attorney's Office. I think that the court has always made clear that the Constitution distinguishes between those two because the president is not an officer. He's not, or she's not appointed. She's not, or he's not picked by the president and confirmed by the Senate, for example. Mm-hmm. There's an appointments clause that takes care of that. Instead, the president is elected. In fact, the president and vice president are only people who are elected by the country as a whole. I think the text is even clearer when you dig deeper because in the sentence you write, it says you can't be an elector for president and vice president. So in the text itself, the 14th Amendment says you can't be an elector for president and vice president.
Yeah.
So then why would they leave the word out when they talk about officer of the United States?
Well, let me turn to Professor Graber for his response on that, because Professor Yu is right. There's no specificity around the word president here. But on the other hand, I also see that, in terms of elected offices, of course, senators and representatives are elected by the people in their state. And I think there's a lot of, let's say, nebulousness around the phrase, or hold any office in the United States. So Professor Graber, what are your thoughts?
Well, first, please note that the General of the Air Force, which did not exist in 1866, is not mentioned. Cabinet officials are not mentioned. What we do know is every member of the 39th Congress that framed the 14th Amendment said the president was an officer of the United States. We know that during the discussions in the ratification debates, everyone said, what's the purpose of the 14th Amendment, Section 3? It is to prevent from holding any office anyone who was an officer and participated in insurrection. Would have been stunned, startled, would not know what you were talking about if they said there was this weird exception for a president who had never held any office. Why would anyone in their right mind, after all, say a federal dog catcher who participates in an insurrection cannot hold an office? But there's an exemption for the highest office in the land. There, if the highest officer in the land bombs Congress, signs a pact with North Korea to drop an atomic bomb on Washington, D.C., well, that person can still be president.
Well, why would anyone? Because textualism and originalism is a very powerful and deeply held legal line of scholarly thinking in this country, and there's many examples of when there's nothing else to look at. Perhaps, let me say, not nothing else to look at, but it's trying to divine the intent of the founders, which is the basis upon which the court decides, Professor Graber.
So presumably, we don't think the founders were idiots. So if we have an interpretation which has the founders doing something we think is stupid, that has no reason, we ask, did they mean that? And notice what I said. Everybody in 1866 said a president is an officer of the United States. So textualism and originalism, if we take the date when the 14th Amendment was framed and ratified, textualism and originalism support including the president. What people may have meant 80 years ago, I think Professor Yu was wrong about 80 years ago, but 80 years ago is not the debate. The debate is, what would an ordinary person understand by officer of the United States in 1866, and here the historical and textual evidence is overwhelming.
So let me get Professor Yu to respond to that, because I think, Professor, just to be clear for listeners, we are talking about the 14th Amendment, as noted, which was not in the original text of the Constitution, right? It is post-Civil War, so it's not necessarily, what did Thomas Jefferson, John Adams et al. Intend in the original text of the Constitution. It is what did the crafters and the ratifiers of the 14th Amendment intend. So what's your response to that?
Actually, I think one way to understand this is there's a difference between textualism and originalism. Textualism means looking at the whole text of the Constitution and reading it together. Originalism, which I have to confess, I have joyously engaged in from time to time. Original means look at the statements of the people who wrote and ratified the amendment at the time and try to understand what they meant. But originalism, or this kind of history, should never, I think, overcome what the text itself says. So, for example, when we say, what does free speech mean? And we could say, well, what did the founders who wrote the First Amendment mean by that? But with what does the word in the actual text of the Constitution mean when you read it all together? This is not some made-up, strange approach to interpreting the Constitution. It started very early on. Chief Justice John Marshall used that approach when he read the Constitution to allow a national bank. Now, so what I read, let me also say, this is a close question. I'm not claiming by any means that this is obvious and clear. I think both sides here have very good arguments. But I think what you're hearing here on the other side is an effort to use that history, of which there's not a lot, because I think everyone has to concede that no one really thought about this problem and that the comments about this are rather stray ones. Is that enough to overcome the text? Because I don't think it's obvious. I don't agree at all that the text elides president into officer of the United States. Instead, repeatedly, the constitutional text makes a difference. They're impeached differently. They're appointed differently. The Supreme Court has said in several opinions recently that the president and officer of the United States are different. This is something actually the justices on the court, they don't agree on much sometimes these days, but they seem to agree on that principle. Another question then that Mark raises is, well, why would they do that? It seems so irrational or senseless. Well, one reason you might say is because the provision already says you can't be an elector for president or vice president. So the people who wrote the 14th Amendment, as you said, Linda, this is right after the Civil War, this is the Reconstruction, they might have said we won't let any Confederates become electors, so they're not going to pick a Confederate president.
Well, Professor John Yu and Professor Mark Graber, stand by for just a second, because there are, of course, several other important legal questions that I'd love to hear your responses to. But we'll do that when we come back from a quick break. This is On Point.
And this is Climate Connections. Worsening storms, wildfires, and other extreme weather are causing a growing risk of power outages in rural northern New Mexico.
A couple years ago, we had winds over 100 miles an hour in the mountains. Besides taking down a lot of our power lines, it just ravaged the forest by taking a lot of trees down.
Luis A. Reyes Jr. is the CEO of Kit Carson Electric Cooperative, which provides power to about 30,000 households in the region. This past fall, the member-owned utility was awarded more than $15 million in funding from the federal bipartisan infrastructure law. Kit Carson will use it to help develop 3 microgrids, solar and battery installations that can operate independently of the larger grid.
And so if the power goes out because of extreme weather, because of wildfire proximity, we have to de-energize power lines. Now more of the population has electricity through storage.
The systems will be installed in the village of El Rito, near a community college, and an indigenous community called Picaris Pueblo, and at Taos Ski Valley, a village in the mountains. Reyes says that Kit Carson demonstrates how utilities can help build a more resilient energy system as extreme weather grows more common. Climate Connections is produced by the Yale Center for Environmental Communication. To learn more about climate change, visit climateconnections.org.
Support for On Point comes from BetterHelp, committed to supporting mental health through therapy. Clients are matched with one of 25,000 therapists and can communicate via video, chat, or phone at betterhelp.com/public. And Vertex Pharmaceuticals, committed to making a difference in biotech to create and deliver innovative therapies for people with serious diseases. Career opportunities at vrtx.com.
You're back with On Point. I'm Meghna Chakrabarty, and today Professor John Yoo and Professor Mark Graber joins us. They have both filed briefs in the major case currently before the United Supreme Court. It's called Trump v. Anderson, and it is a case where the justices are being asked to decide whether Donald Trump should or should be disqualified from the presidency. Now, professors, I'd like to dive into the second major question here, and that is of whether or not Donald Trump actually engaged or aided an insurrection on January 6th. So, Professor Graber, let me read a little bit from Professor Yoo's brief here to the court, where he says that the breadth of the term insurrection in the absence of legislative definition is uncertain and indeterminate. And then the brief says, quote, if an insurrection against the Constitution includes any interference with the execution of any of the functions of the branches of the federal government, it sweeps too widely, end quote. So, Professor Graber, is there a legal basis for a more robust definition for insurrection, and did Donald Trump engage in that?
Insurrection was well known in the 19th century. John Marshall, first Chief Justice, Joseph Story, Benjamin Curtis, Stephen Field, all the justices had a common definition. An insurrection involved an assemblage. There was clearly an assemblage on January 6th, lots of people. The assemblage was resisting, in the case of the United States, federal law. Well, that assemblage was resisting the peaceful transfer of presidential power. The third thing, they were resisting by force, violence, and intimidation. People died, people were injured. There was clearly force, violence, and intimidation on January 6th, and it must be for a public purpose. They were not there to sell congressional furniture on eBay. They were there to protest a stolen election. The common law constitutional rules are also very, very clear. Anyone who knowingly assists or incites an insurrection is an insurrectionist. Donald Trump uses incendiary rhetoric. He is told that's inspiring violence. He doubles down. He says, come to Washington and be wild. He's told that is inspiring violence. He doubles down. He is told there are people in the crowd bent on violence. He says when there's fraud, you don't do the usual things. Fight like hell, save our country. I think a reasonable person could conclude this is not a person who is simply for peace.
Professor Graber, let me follow up with that, though, because this is where, admittedly to both of you, my understanding of the sort of far limits of speech protections is a little hazy, because I've heard in response to your argument that it was, Trump never said go directly to Congress and interfere or stop the certification of electoral votes. I mean, the things that he said that you cited could arguably be have read in a multiplicity of different ways. So how is that a direct support or incitement of insurrection?
Well, the question is, how would a reasonable person interpret it? So consider two versions. My spouse, knowing I'm going to be on this show, says, fight hard. Probably it's a metaphor. My spouse, seeing me with a gun, with a weapon, says, fight those SOBs. That's probably an incitement to violence. Context matters. When you know people are armed, when you've been informed people are planning violence, and you tell them fight, when you tell them when you're dealing with fraud, you don't use the usual methods, I think a reasonable person could conclude that is incitement to violence.
Professor Yoo, do you see that same clarity around the definition of insurrection as Professor Graber lays out?
First, let me start out by saying you, Professor Graber, I'm conceding are reasonable people. So I'm not going to argue with whether either of you might think Donald Trump committed insurrection. I think this question is about who gets to decide whether there's an insurrection. As every county official in the country who runs an election in their local town get to decide and get to strike, not just Donald Trump. The clause applies to basically every federal and state officer elected and appointed. Do they get to sit there and edit the ballots? I don't think so. I think instead what we should do is have Congress decide by statute. And one more thing, Congress did pass a statute. There is an insurrection statute. It's a criminal violation. And Congress, having passed that statute, could leave it up to the Justice Department to prosecute Donald Trump and anyone else connected with the January 6th. And I think if they're convicted, they would then trigger the 14th Amendment. Then I think state officials could, having seen that some officer in the federal government has found through a legitimate process like a criminal trial that Donald Trump was an insurrectionist, they could then strike him off the ballot. Congress could issue some kind of resolution, as it did for Confederates after the Civil War, one